The thermometer outside Lars Bergmann's cabin read minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of January 23, 1936. By noon, it had dropped to minus 50. By evening, minus 60, and it was still falling. The radio from Fort Benton, crackling through static, reported that the coldest temperature ever recorded in the continental United States had just been broken. Minus 70 degrees in Rogers Pass, just 60 miles south of his homestead. The announcer's voice carried a note of disbelief that matched what Lars felt in his bones. But Lars wasn't listening anymore. He was outside in the screaming wind, doing something that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching. He was burying his cabin, deliberately, methodically, shoveling snow against the walls, packing it tight, building it higher. His neighbors, the few hardy souls who'd stuck out the winter in the remote Teton River Valley, thought he'd lost his mind. When William Morrison rode by on his way to check his cattle, he stopped and stared. "Bergmann, what in God's name are you doing?" Morrison shouted over the wind. "You trying to bury yourself alive?" Lars didn't stop working. "I'm trying to stay alive." Morrison shook his head. "You're supposed to keep the snow away from your cabin, not pile it on. Everyone knows that. Snow will rot your logs, collapse your roof. You've gone mad from the cold." Lars paused, leaning on his shovel. His breath froze in the air between them, ice crystals glittering in the weak winter sun. "Everyone knows a lot of things that aren't true. Snow doesn't conduct heat. Air does. I'm building the thickest wall between me and that cold that nature can provide." Morrison rode away, convinced he'd just witnessed a man's final descent into winter madness. He told everyone in Fort Benton that the Norwegian up the Teton had finally cracked, was burying his own cabin, would probably be found frozen solid come spring. The story spread. People laughed. They shook their heads. They placed bets on how long Lars Bergmann would last. Then the temperature hit minus 72 degrees Fahrenheit on the night of January 25, 1936. And everything those people thought they knew about surviving cold proved worthless. While cabins across Montana burned through cord after cord of firewood and still couldn't keep their occupants from freezing, while cattle died standing up in their fields, while pipes burst and people huddled under every blanket they owned and still shivered, Lars Bergmann sat in his buried cabin in relative comfort. The interior temperature held steady at 45 degrees, without a fire burning. The story of how a Norwegian immigrant figured out what indigenous peoples had known for millennia, what Arctic explorers would later prove scientifically, and what modern survival experts now teach, is about understanding the counterintuitive nature of cold weather survival. It's about how the deadliest cold in American history taught one man to see snow not as the enemy, but as the solution. And it's about how knowledge that seems like madness can be the difference between life and death when the temperature drops to levels where exposed skin freezes in under 2 minutes. Lars Bergmann arrived in Montana in 1928. He was 31 years old, unmarried, and carried with him two things that would define his life on the American frontier. A letter from his brother Olaf describing homestead opportunities in the Teton River Valley, and memories of winters in northern Norway that made Montana seem almost mild by comparison. Almost. He'd grown up in Finnmark, the northernmost county of Norway, where winter darkness lasted 2 months and temperatures regularly dropped to minus 40 degrees or colder. His family had been fishermen and small farmers, people who survived in conditions that would kill the unprepared. They'd taught him things about cold that weren't written in any book. The homestead he claimed was 160 acres along the Teton River, 23 miles northwest of Fort Benton. It was isolated, even by Montana standards. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. The land was marginal for farming, better suited to cattle, but Lars had other plans. He would trap, hunt, and raise enough crops and livestock to sustain himself. He would live the way his ancestors had lived, in harmony with the land and the seasons, not fighting against them. The first thing he built was his cabin, and here's where his Norwegian upbringing showed itself. While other settlers in the area were throwing up quick structures, Lars took his time. He built with logs that were 14 inches thick, twice the size most people used. He created a double-wall design on the north and west sides, filling the gap with sawdust he hauled from a mill in Fort Benton. He constructed a massive stone fireplace, but positioned it in the center of the cabin rather than against an outer wall. He built a foundation that raised the cabin 2 feet off the ground. He installed a small root cellar beneath the floor, accessed by a trap door. Every decision was deliberate. Every technique had a purpose. His neighbors thought he was overbuilding, wasting time and money on a cabin that was far more substantial than necessary. They'd been in Montana for years. They knew what worked. Lars was new. He'd learn. The cabin took him most of the summer and fall of 1928. He moved in just before the first snow. That winter was mild by Montana standards. Temperatures rarely dropped below 0. Lars's cabin stayed warm with minimal firewood. He was comfortable, even cozy. His neighbors felt vindicated. See, they said, he'd built all that excessive structure for nothing. Any decent cabin would have worked just fine. But Lars knew something they didn't. He knew that mild winters were statistical anomalies. He knew that the real test would come eventually, and he knew that when it did, there would be no second chance to prepare. The next 7 winters were equally mild. Temperatures occasionally dropped to -10 or -20, but nothing extreme. Nothing that tested the limits of standard construction. Lars continued his routine, trapping in winter, farming in summer, living alone but not lonely. He made occasional trips to Fort Benton for supplies. He was polite but private. People considered him a bit odd, very Norwegian, very solitary but harmless. He was just another homesteader trying to make it on the frontier. Then came the winter of 1935 to 1936. It started normally enough. First snow in November, cold but manageable. December brought colder temperatures but nothing unusual. Then January arrived, and with it came weather that redefined what cold meant. The first hint came on January 7th. The temperature dropped to -35 overnight. Not unprecedented, but notable. Livestock started showing signs of stress. People began burning more firewood. Then, on January 15th, a high-pressure system settled over Montana. High pressure in winter means clear skies. Clear skies mean no insulating cloud cover. No cloud cover means heat radiates into space unobstructed. The temperature began falling like a stone. -40 on January 16th. -45 on January 17th. -50 on January 18th. The radio stations were reporting records being broken across the state. In Fort Benton, the temperature hit -55 degrees, the coldest ever recorded there. In Havre, -58, in Cutbank, -60, and still it kept falling. On January 20th, the radio reported that Rogers Pass, in the mountains south of the Teton Valley, had recorded -66 degrees Fahrenheit. It was the coldest temperature ever recorded in the continental United States outside of Alaska. The previous record had stood since 1893. People listened to that broadcast in stunned silence. -66 degrees. It was a number that seemed almost abstract. How could air get that cold? How could anything survive in that? But the temperature wasn't done falling. January 21st brought -68 at Rogers Pass. January 22nd, -69. And on January 23rd, the day Lars Bergmann started burying his cabin in snow, the thermometer at Rogers Pass recorded -70 degrees Fahrenheit. By January 25th, it would hit -72 degrees, a record that would stand for decades. At -72 degrees Fahrenheit, exposed skin freezes in less than 2 minutes. Breath freezes in the air and falls as ice crystals. Metal becomes brittle and can shatter. Rubber and plastic become rigid and crack. Fuel lines freeze. Engines won't start. Normal life becomes impossible. And standard homestead cabins, the kind that worked perfectly well in normal Montana winters, became death traps. The problem wasn't that people didn't know how to stay warm. They did. They built fires, they piled on blankets, they blocked drafts. They did everything that conventional wisdom said to do, but at minus 72 degrees, conventional wisdom wasn't enough. Fireplaces that normally heated a cabin adequately were suddenly inadequate. People were burning firewood at unsustainable rates and still couldn't maintain a comfortable interior temperature. The cold was penetrating the walls faster than the fires could compensate. Some families were going through a cord of wood a day. A cord of wood, that's 128 cubic feet of stacked wood, in a single day, and they were still cold. The reason was simple physics, though most people on the Montana frontier in 1936 didn't think in those terms. They just knew that the cold was winning and they were running out of fuel. Heat moves from warm to cold through three primary mechanisms: conduction through solid materials, convection through air or liquids, and radiation through empty space. At minus 72 degrees outside and 60 degrees inside a cabin, the temperature differential is 132 degrees. That's an enormous gradient. Heat wants to equalize. It's going to flow from the warm interior to the cold exterior through every possible pathway. Conduction through the log walls, convection through air leaks, radiation through windows and thin materials. The only way to slow this heat loss is to create barriers. Insulation. And the problem with most cabins on the Montana frontier was that they didn't have enough of it. Logs are decent insulators, but not great. A 12-inch thick log wall has an R value of roughly 8 to 10. That means it takes 8 to 10 hours for 1 BTU of heat to pass through 1 square foot of the wall. At minus 72 degrees, heat is hammering at those walls relentlessly. The logs can't stop it. They can only slow it down, and they can't slow it down enough. This is what Lars Bergmann understood. He'd seen it in Norway. He'd seen winters where the cold was so intense that normal buildings couldn't cope. And he'd seen how the Sami people, the indigenous inhabitants of northern Scandinavia, dealt with extreme cold. They didn't fight it with fire alone. They used insulation, massive amounts of insulation. They built structures that were partially underground. They piled snow and earth against their winter dwellings. They understood that the best defense against extreme cold was to create the thickest possible barrier between the interior and the exterior. Snow, counterintuitively, is one of the best insulators available in a winter environment. Fresh, fluffy snow can have an R value of up to 7 per inch. That means a foot of snow has an R value of 84. A 3-foot thick snowbank against a cabin wall has an R value of over 200. 200. Compare that to the log wall's R value of 8 to 10, and you begin to understand why Lars Bergmann was shoveling snow against his cabin instead of away from it. But here's the critical part that Lars understood and his neighbors didn't. The snow isn't insulating because it's cold. It's insulating because it's full of trapped air. Snow is approximately 90 to 95% air. Air is an excellent insulator, but only if it's not moving. Convection, the movement of air, carries heat away rapidly. But if you can trap air in place, prevent it from moving, it becomes a barrier. Each snowflake, each ice crystal, creates tiny pockets of still air. Millions of pockets. Billions of pockets. All of them together form an insulating blanket. The Inuit people of the Arctic have known this for thousands of years. An igloo, built from blocks of compacted snow, can maintain an interior temperature of 40 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the exterior temperature is minus 40 or colder, without any heat source other than body heat and maybe a small oil lamp. The snow dome is typically 18 inches to 24 inches thick. That's enough insulation to create a livable environment in the most hostile conditions on Earth. Arctic explorers learned this principle the hard way. Early expeditions that relied on wooden huts and heavy heating struggled and often failed. Later expeditions that learned to build snow shelters or bury their structures in snow survived and thrived. The snow shelter became standard procedure for polar exploration. But in 1936, Montana, This knowledge wasn't widespread. Most American settlers had never seen an igloo. They'd never lived in conditions that required understanding snow as insulation. They knew snow as the enemy, something to be cleared away, something that brought cold. The idea of deliberately piling it against your house seemed insane. Lars Bergmann knew better. He'd seen it work. And on January 23, 1936, when the temperature was heading toward minus 72 degrees, and his cabin's interior temperature was starting to drop despite a roaring fire, he made his decision. He was going to bury his cabin in snow. He started on the north wall, the one that faced the prevailing wind. He shoveled snow from the surrounding area and packed it against the logs. Not loosely, packed tight. He wanted to eliminate air gaps. He wanted the snow compressed enough that it wouldn't settle and leave spaces. He built it up from the foundation to the roofline, a solid bank of snow 3 to 4 feet thick. The work was brutal. The temperature was minus 40 and still falling. The wind was relentless. His face was numb within minutes. His fingers ached inside his heavy mittens. His breath froze on his beard, coating it with ice. But he kept working. This wasn't optional. This was survival. The west wall came next. Same process. Shovel, pack, build up. 3 to 4 feet thick. Solid from foundation to roof. By the time he finished, the sun was setting and the temperature had dropped to minus 50. He went inside, closed the door, and stoked his fire. Then he waited. The night of January 23rd to 24th was one of the coldest nights in American history. Across Montana, people huddled by their fireplaces, burning wood as fast as they could feed it into the flames, and still they shivered. In Fort Benton, a family burned all their furniture to stay warm when their firewood ran out. In Choteau, a rancher lost 300 head of cattle in a single night. In Great Falls, pipes froze and burst in supposedly well-protected buildings. And at Rogers Pass, the thermometer hit minus 70 degrees. But inside Lars Bergmann's snow-buried cabin, something remarkable happened. The interior temperature stabilized. He'd built a fire around 6 p.m. and fed it until it was burning hot. By 8 p.m., he let it die down to coals. By 10 p.m., it was out. He checked his thermometer. The interior temperature was 52 degrees. He went to bed. When he woke at 6 a.m., the fire was completely cold. Outside, the temperature was minus 65 degrees. Inside, the thermometer read 48 degrees. The snow packed against his north and west walls had created a barrier that even the most extreme cold in American history couldn't fully penetrate. His cabin had lost only 4 degrees of heat overnight, without any fire at all. If you're enjoying this look into extreme survival and forgotten wilderness wisdom, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're uncovering the stories and techniques that kept people alive in conditions we can barely imagine today. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story. Now let's continue with what happened when Lars tested his theory even further. Lars spent the next day reinforcing his snow walls. He added more snow to the north and west sides, building them up to 5 feet thick. Then he did something that seemed even more radical. He started burying the south and east walls. These walls got some sun during the day, so they didn't need as much insulation, but they still needed protection from the cold. He built the snow walls on these sides to about 3 feet thick. By the evening of January 24th, his entire cabin was encased in snow from foundation to roofline. Only the door, one window, and the chimney remained exposed. It looked like a snowdrift had consumed the building. It looked, to anyone passing by, like a structure that had been abandoned and buried by winter. That night, the temperature hit minus 70 degrees. Lars ran the same test. Fire until 8 p.m. Let it die. No fire overnight. Morning temperature inside, 46 degrees. The cabin had lost 2 more degrees, but that was because he'd let cold air in when he went outside for more firewood. The baseline was holding, 45 to 50 degrees inside without any active heating, in minus 70-degree weather. He'd done it. He'd created a livable environment using nothing but snow as insulation. But the real test was about to come. Not whether he could survive, but whether his survival technique could save others. On January 26th, 3 days into the record cold, a man appeared at Lars's door. His name was Henry Whitman. He was 62 years old, a widower who'd homesteaded land 8 miles east of Lars. He was nearly frozen. His cabin had burned down. Henry explained through chattering teeth what had happened. He'd been burning wood constantly, trying to keep warm. His fireplace had been going full blast for 3 days straight. The chimney had overheated. He hadn't cleaned it properly before winter. Creosote buildup had ignited. The chimney fire had spread to the roof. Within minutes, his cabin was engulfed. He'd barely escaped with his life. He'd grabbed a blanket and run out into -60-degree weather. His nearest neighbor was William Morrison, but Morrison's place was 12 miles away in the opposite direction. Lars's cabin was closer. Henry had walked 8 miles through the worst cold in American history, wrapped in a single blanket. That he survived at all was a miracle. That he could still walk when he reached Lars's door was beyond belief. Lars pulled him inside. The warmth, relative warmth of 45 degrees, hit Henry like a physical force. He collapsed. Lars got him out of his frozen clothes, wrapped him in dry blankets and placed him by the fire. He made hot coffee. He cooked hot food. Henry slowly came back to life. When he could finally speak clearly, his first words were, "Why is it so warm in here? How is this possible?" Lars explained. The snow walls, the insulation, the principle of trapped air. Henry listened, his expression moving from confusion to understanding, to something like awe. "You buried your cabin. Everyone said you'd gone mad." Lars smiled. "Maybe I have, but I'm alive, and warm." Henry stayed for 6 days. The temperature remained below -50 for all 6 days. The cabin's interior temperature never dropped below 42 degrees, even when they let the fire go out completely for 12 hours to conserve firewood. Henry watched Lars manage the environment. Small fire twice a day to bring the temperature up to 55 or 60 degrees. Let it die. The snow walls held the warmth. It was the most efficient heating system Henry had ever seen. On February 1st, the temperature finally rose above zero for the first time in 9 days. It was -5 degrees, practically tropical. Henry was healthy enough to leave. Before he went, he asked Lars to teach him exactly how to build snow walls. Lars walked him around the cabin, explaining every detail. The thickness, the packing technique, the importance of eliminating air gaps, which walls needed the most insulation, how to leave clearance for the door and window, how to protect the chimney while still allowing it to draft properly. Henry listened carefully. Then he asked, "When I rebuild my cabin, can I do this?" Lars nodded. "You can, and you should. Next time this cold comes, and it will come again, you'll be ready." Henry left. He told everyone he met about what he'd seen. A cabin buried in snow that stayed warm without burning firewood constantly. A survival technique so counterintuitive that it seemed like madness. But it worked. He'd experienced it. The story spread faster than Henry could travel. By the time he reached Fort Benton, half the town had heard about Lars Bergmann's snow-buried cabin. Reactions were mixed. Some people were intrigued. If it really worked, if it really could keep a cabin warm in -70-degree weather using minimal firewood, then it was revolutionary. Other people were skeptical. Snow against your cabin? That's how you got rot. That's how you got moisture damage. That's how you ruined your logs. The skeptics were vocal. They insisted that Lars had just gotten lucky. They insisted that his cabin would be ruined come spring. They insisted that anyone who followed his example was a fool. But a few people listened. William Morrison, Lars's neighbor, was one of them. Morrison had lost his wife in the cold. His cabin had been adequate for normal winters, but not for this one. He'd burned every piece of furniture. He'd torn boards off his barn to feed his fire. He'd done everything possible, and it hadn't been enough. When he heard about Lars's technique, he didn't hesitate. He rode to Lars's cabin. He examined the snow walls. He felt the warmth inside. He asked questions. Lars answered every one. Then Morrison went home and started burying his own cabin. He worked for 2 days straight, building snow walls 4 feet thick on all sides. When he was done, he ran his own test. The results were the same. Interior temperature held steady at 40 to 50 degrees with minimal fire. He'd transformed his cabin from a cold box that consumed firewood into an efficient, comfortable space. Other homesteaders followed. Not everyone. Many people remained skeptical or were too exhausted from fighting the cold to try something new. But those who did build snow walls discovered the same thing. It worked. Dramatically. Obviously. Undeniably. The winter of 1935 to 1936 finally released its grip in late February. The temperature rose above freezing for the first time in over a month. Snow began melting. People emerged from their cabins, exhausted, traumatized, but alive. The accounting of losses began. Cattle. Tens of thousands of cattle dead across Montana. Some ranchers lost their entire herds. The carcasses would litter the prairie for months, too frozen to decompose until spring truly arrived. Property. Hundreds of buildings damaged or destroyed. Burst pipes, collapsed roofs, fire damage from overheated stoves and chimneys. The repair costs would run into millions of dollars. People. The exact number of deaths was never fully documented. Some estimates put it at over 100 people across Montana. Alone. Freezing. Starvation when they couldn't reach supplies. Accidents while trying to cope with the cold. The human cost was staggering. And firewood. The amount of firewood consumed during that winter was astronomical. Forests near settlements were stripped bare. Trees that had stood for decades were cut down in the desperate scramble for fuel. Some homesteaders burned more wood in 2 months than they normally would in 2 years. But the homesteaders who had buried their cabins in snow had a different experience. They'd used a fraction of the firewood. They'd stayed comfortable. They'd survived without desperation or trauma. And their cabins were fine. When the snow melted, the logs underneath were intact. No rot, no moisture damage. The snow had actually protected the logs from the drying effects of the extreme cold. The skeptics were proven wrong. The technique worked, and it didn't damage the structure. Lars Bergmann became something of a celebrity in the Teton River Valley. People who'd mocked him 6 months earlier now sought his advice. How did he know to do this? How did he figure it out? Lars's answers were simple. He hadn't figured it out. He'd learned it from people who'd been using snow as insulation for thousands of years. The Sami in Norway, the Inuit in the Arctic, indigenous peoples around the world who lived in extreme cold. They'd all known this. He'd just applied their wisdom to his situation. This was the critical point. Lars wasn't a genius. He wasn't even particularly inventive. He was observant. He was willing to learn from other cultures, and he was willing to do something that seemed counterintuitive because he understood the principle behind it. That willingness to learn, that willingness to question conventional wisdom, that made the difference. The following winter, 1936 to 1937, was relatively mild, but the winter after that, 1937 to 1938, brought another bout of extreme cold. Not as severe as 1935 to 1936, but still brutal. Temperatures dropped to -40 and below for extended periods. This time, dozens of homesteaders in the Teton River Valley and surrounding areas built snow walls around their cabins. The results were consistent. Warmer interiors, less firewood consumption, more comfortable living conditions. The technique was spreading. Word of mouth carried it from valley to valley, from settlement to settlement. By the early 1940s, snow walling, as it came to be called, was a recognized winter survival technique across northern Montana. Not everyone used it. Many people still preferred traditional methods. But those who faced the most extreme conditions, those who lived in the most isolated areas, those who couldn't afford to burn massive amounts of firewood, they learned to bury their cabins in snow. The science behind why this works is straightforward, though it wasn't fully understood in the 1930s. Snow is a porous material composed of ice crystals with air spaces between them. The air spaces are the key. Air has very low thermal conductivity. It doesn't transfer heat well. When air is trapped in small spaces and can't move through convection, it becomes an excellent insulator. This is how all insulation works. Fiberglass insulation is just glass fibers with trapped air. Foam insulation is just bubbles of trapped air. Down feathers are just fibers creating pockets of trapped air. Snow is naturally occurring insulation. The R value of snow varies depending on its density. Fresh, fluffy snow has the highest R value, around 7 per inch. Denser, packed snow has a slightly lower R value, around 5 per inch. But even packed snow is an excellent insulator. A 3-foot thick wall of packed snow has an R value of 180. For comparison, a modern insulated exterior wall in a house might have an R value of 20 to 30. The snow wall has 6 times the insulating value. But there's a second factor that Lars understood instinctively: thermal mass. The snow itself has thermal mass. Once the snow wall is in place and the cabin interior warms up, the snow closest to the cabin walls gradually warms too, not to above freezing, but to warmer than the exterior air temperature. This creates a gradient: exterior air at minus 60 degrees, outer layer of snow at minus 50 degrees, middle layer of snow at minus 30 degrees, inner layer of snow at minus 10 degrees, cabin wall at plus 10 degrees, interior air at plus 50 degrees. The gradient spreads the temperature change over 3 feet of distance instead of over 12 inches of log wall. This dramatically reduces the rate of heat transfer. The cabin doesn't have to fight a 110-degree temperature differential across 12 inches. It's fighting a 60-degree differential across 3 feet. The math changes completely. There's also a third factor: wind protection. At minus 60 degrees with a 20-mile-per-hour wind, the wind chill factor makes it feel like minus 100 degrees. Wind chill doesn't actually lower the temperature of objects, but it dramatically increases the rate of heat loss from any warm surface. A cabin wall exposed to wind loses heat much faster than a cabin wall in still air. The snow wall creates a barrier that stops the wind completely. The air trapped in the snow doesn't move. There's no convective heat loss through the snow wall. The cabin wall is sheltered in perfectly still air. This by itself can reduce heat loss by 50% or more. When you combine all 3 factors, high R value insulation, thermal mass gradient, and wind protection, the result is a structure that can maintain livable interior temperatures with minimal heating, even in the most extreme cold. This is why igloos work. This is why snow caves are emergency shelters. This is why burying a cabin in snow is not madness, but physics. Lars Bergmann lived on his Montana homestead until 1952. He eventually married in 1941 to a widow named Helen who'd lost her husband in a logging accident. They had 2 children. He expanded his cabin twice, adding rooms as his family grew. Every winter, he built snow walls. Every winter, his cabin stayed warm with minimal firewood. He never stopped being grateful for the knowledge he'd brought from Norway. In 1948, a young journalist from Great Falls came to interview him. By then, Lars was 71 years old. The journalist wanted to know about the winter of 1935 to 1936, about the record cold, about the snow walling technique, about how he'd survived. Lars told the story. The journalist asked what the most important lesson was. Lars thought for a moment. Then he said, "People think survival is about being tough, about enduring, about fighting through. But that's not survival. That's just suffering. Real survival is about being smart, about learning, about using what nature gives you. The snow was there. The principle was there. I just had to see it." The journalist wrote an article that appeared in several Montana newspapers. It sparked renewed interest in snow walling. Some people who'd never heard of the technique learned about it for the first time. Others who dismissed it as a Depression era, desperation measure reconsidered. The technique gained a kind of legitimacy. By the 1950s, the military was studying snow shelters as part of cold weather survival training. The principles Lars had used were being taught to soldiers who might have to survive in Arctic conditions. Snow trenches, snow caves, quinzhees, all based on the same fundamental understanding that snow is insulation. By the 1960s, outdoor recreation enthusiasts were building snow shelters for winter camping. What had once been a survival necessity became a wilderness skill. Mountaineers used snow caves. Backcountry skiers built quinzhees. Winter campers learned to pile snow over their tents for added insulation. The knowledge had come full circle, from indigenous peoples who'd known it for millennia, to Lars Bergmann who'd brought it from Norway, to Montana homesteaders who'd learned it from necessity, to the military and outdoors people who'd learned it from documentation and training. The principle remained the same. Snow is not the enemy. Snow is a tool. Before we continue with the legacy of Lars's technique and the science that proved him right, I want to ask you to do something. If this story has shown you something you didn't know, something that might save a life someday, share it. Hit that subscribe button and make sure you're following along for more forgotten survival wisdom. The knowledge that kept our ancestors alive is still out there, waiting to be remembered. Now let's look at what modern science has to say about Lars's snow walling technique. Modern cold weather research has confirmed everything Lars Bergmann understood through observation and experience. A study conducted by the Army Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory in 1972 measured the insulating properties of snow under various conditions. Their findings were conclusive. Fresh snow, density 0.1 to 0.2 grams per cubic centimeter, had an R value of 6 to 7 per inch. Settled snow, density 0.2 to 0.3 grams per cubic centimeter, had an R value of 4 to 5 per inch. Compacted snow, density 0.3 to 0.4 grams per cubic centimeter, had an R value of 3 to 4 per inch. Even the densest snow tested was a better insulator than most building materials used in the 1930s. The study also measured interior temperatures of snow shelters under controlled conditions. A snow cave with 18-inch thick walls maintained an interior temperature of 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit when exterior temperatures were -20 to -30 degrees, with body heat alone, no additional heating source. A quinzhee, which is a hollowed-out snow pile, showed similar results. The thicker the walls, the more stable the interior temperature. A 3-foot-thick quinzhee wall could maintain a 40-degree interior even when exterior temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. The researchers concluded that snow shelters were among the most effective emergency shelters available in winter conditions. Superior to most temporary structures. Superior to most tents. Superior to many permanent buildings that weren't specifically designed for extreme cold. This scientific validation came 40 years after Lars Bergmann buried his cabin in snow, but it confirmed what he'd known all along. The technique worked, and it worked for predictable, measurable, scientific reasons. Not luck, not magic, physics. Other cold weather survival research has focused on the different types of snow shelters and their relative effectiveness. The igloo, built from cut blocks of compacted snow, is the most efficient design. The dome shape provides maximum interior volume with minimum surface area, reducing heat loss. The entrance tunnel, built below the main floor level, creates a cold trap. Cold air sinks into the tunnel. Warm air rises and stays in the dome. The thick walls, 18 to 24 inches, provide massive insulation. An igloo can be 60 degrees warmer than the exterior temperature. The snow cave, dug into an existing snowbank, is the quickest to build, but requires the right conditions. Deep, consolidated snow. A steep bank or drift, the advantage is speed. An experienced person can dig a survival snow cave in under an hour. The disadvantage is limited control over wall thickness and structural integrity. But for emergency shelter, it's highly effective. The quinzhee, built by piling snow and then hollowing it out, is more versatile. It doesn't require existing snowbanks. It can be built on flat terrain. The process takes longer, usually 3 to 6 hours. Pile snow, Let it settle for 1 to 2 hours. Hollow it out, but the result is a structure with consistent wall thickness and good integrity. For extended stays, the Quincy is often the best choice. All of these shelters rely on the same principle Lars Bergmann used. Snow as insulation. The designs differ, but the physics are identical. Trap air, stop wind, create a thermal mass gradient. The result is a warm shelter in cold conditions. Lars Bergmann died in 1963 at the age of 86. His cabin still stood, though it had been modified and expanded multiple times. His children inherited the homestead. They continued living there, continuing the tradition of building snow walls every winter. In 1984, one of Lars's granddaughters, Karen Bergman Fisher, wrote a short book about her grandfather's life. The book included detailed instructions for snow walling a cabin, complete with diagrams and measurements. It also included interviews with other Montana old-timers who'd learned the technique from Lars or who'd learned it independently. The book didn't sell widely, but it became a valued resource among cold-weather survival enthusiasts and historians of frontier life. Copies occasionally appear on auction sites, selling for substantial sums. It's considered a primary source document on traditional cold-weather survival techniques. In 2006, the original Bergmann homestead was designated a Montana Heritage Site. A historical marker was installed, describing Lars's innovations and their impact on frontier survival. The cabin itself no longer stands. It was torn down in the 1970s when the family built a modern house. But the site is preserved, and tours are occasionally offered during summer months. The winter of 1935 to 1936 remains the coldest winter in modern American history. The minus 72-degree temperature recorded at Rogers Pass on January 25, 1936, stood as the record for the continental United States for decades. It wasn't broken until January 1954, when a temperature of minus 70 degrees was recorded in Utah. Then, in 1985, a new record was set in Alaska. But for the continental United States outside of Alaska, the Rogers Pass record still stands. Minus 72 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 104 degrees below freezing. That's cold enough to freeze gasoline. Cold enough to shatter steel. Cold enough to kill exposed flesh in under 90 seconds. And in that cold, Lars Bergmann sat in his snow-buried cabin in relative comfort. That's the legacy. Not that he survived, though that's remarkable, but that he understood how to survive, that he saw what others didn't see, that he was willing to do what seemed like madness because he knew it was science. The modern outdoor industry has absorbed these lessons. Winter. Camping gear now emphasizes the same principles Lars used: insulation, wind protection, moisture management, thermal mass. Four-season tents are designed with thick insulating walls. Sleeping bags are rated for extreme cold with careful attention to air-trapping materials. Sleeping pads have high R values to prevent conductive heat loss to the ground. Every piece of gear reflects an understanding that Lars would have recognized immediately. Stop the heat from leaving. Use every available material as insulation. Respect the physics of cold. Winter survival courses teach snow shelter construction as a core skill. Search and rescue teams train in building emergency snow shelters. Military survival programs include extensive cold weather modules. The knowledge has been formalized, systematized, and distributed. But the fundamental insights remain unchanged from what Lars Bergmann demonstrated in 1936. The story of Lars Bergmann and his snow-buried cabin resonates because it challenges our assumptions. We assume that the way to fight cold is with heat. Build a bigger fire, burn more fuel, create more warmth, and that works to a point. But there's a more elegant solution. Don't fight the cold. Use the cold's own materials against it. The snow that brings the cold can also protect you from the cold. The principle applies beyond winter survival. It's a metaphor for problem-solving in general. Sometimes the solution to a problem isn't to fight harder. It's to change your perspective, to see the problem differently, to use what seems like a disadvantage as an advantage. Lars saw snow as insulation when everyone else saw it as an obstacle. That shift in perspective saved his life and changed how people approached winter survival. The homesteaders who mocked Lars in January 1936 were not stupid. They were operating on the best information they had. In their experience, snow against a cabin was bad. It led to moisture problems. It potentially damaged the structure. Their conventional wisdom was based on real observations. The problem was that their experience was based on normal winters. They'd never experienced minus 72-degree cold. They'd never needed extreme solutions. When the extreme conditions arrived, their conventional wisdom failed them. Lars's unconventional approach succeeded. This pattern repeats throughout history. Conventional wisdom works fine in normal conditions. But when conditions become extreme, when the situation moves outside the range of normal experience, conventional wisdom can become dangerous. The person who questions conventional wisdom, who looks for solutions outside the accepted norms, that person often survives when others don't. This doesn't mean conventional wisdom is always wrong. Most of the time, it's right. That's why it became conventional, but it does mean that we should be willing to question it when conditions change, to ask whether the old rules still apply, to look for new solutions when the old solutions stop working. Lars Bergmann's willingness to question the conventional wisdom about snow, to apply knowledge from a different culture and a different context, gave him a massive advantage when the record cold arrived. He wasn't smarter than his neighbors, he wasn't tougher, he wasn't luckier, he was more informed. He had knowledge they didn't have, and he was willing to act on that knowledge even when others thought he was crazy. That's the ultimate lesson. Knowledge is survival, not gear, not toughness, not luck. Knowledge, understanding how the world works, understanding physics, even if you don't know the formal terms, understanding that cold air sinks and warm air rises, understanding that still air insulates but moving air conducts heat, understanding that snow is mostly air. These pieces of knowledge, combined and applied, made the difference between comfort and misery, between survival and death. The modern world has made us soft in some ways. We have central heating, we have insulated houses, we have weather forecasts and emergency services. We rarely face the kind of extreme survival situations that frontier homesteaders faced routinely. But we've also lost knowledge in the process. We've outsourced our survival to technology and infrastructure. When that technology fails, when that infrastructure breaks down, many of us would be helpless. We don't know how to stay warm without electricity. We don't know how to find food without grocery stores. We don't know how to navigate without GPS. The knowledge that kept our ancestors alive has been forgotten by most of us. Stories like Lars Bergmann's are important because they remind us that this knowledge exists, that it's not magic or folklore. It's practical, applicable, scientific knowledge, and it can be relearned. The skills Lars used are not lost. They're documented. They're teachable. Anyone can learn to build a snow shelter. Anyone can learn the principles of cold weather survival. The knowledge is available. We just have to value it. We just have to recognize that in a world that seems increasingly unstable, where extreme weather events are becoming more common, where infrastructure can fail, this old knowledge might be necessary again. We might need to know how to survive without modern conveniences. And if that day comes, the people who survive will be the ones who learned from the past, who studied the techniques of Lars Bergmann and others like him, who understood that survival is not about fighting nature, but about working with it. The cabin buried in snow is a powerful image. It looks like defeat, like a structure overwhelmed by winter, but it's actually a fortress, a warm refuge in the coldest conditions imaginable. What looks like weakness is strength. What looks like madness is wisdom. This reversal, this counterintuitive truth, is at the heart of survival. the ability to see beyond appearances, to understand underlying principles, to act on knowledge even when it contradicts instinct. Lars Bergmann had that ability. He brought it from Norway. He applied it in Montana, and he saved not just his own life, but the lives of others who learned from him. Henry Whitman, who walked 8 miles through -60-degree cold and survived. William Morrison, who rebuilt after losing his wife and found that Lars's technique worked. Dozens of other homesteaders who built snow walls and discovered that their cabins stayed warm with a fraction of the firewood. All of them benefited from one man's willingness to question conventional wisdom and apply knowledge from elsewhere. That's the real story, not just surviving extreme cold, but the power of knowledge to save lives. The importance of learning from other cultures, the value of questioning assumptions, the courage to do what seems crazy because you understand why it's right. When temperatures hit -72 degrees in Montana, Lars Bergmann buried his cabin in snow to stay alive. Everyone thought he was insane. He was actually the sanest man in the valley. He understood physics. He understood insulation. He understood that snow, properly used, was not the enemy, but the solution. And that understanding made all the difference. The thermometer outside Lars Bergmann's cabin read -40 degrees on January 23, 1936. He started burying his cabin. By January 25th, when the temperature hit -72 degrees, he was sitting inside in relative comfort, while others burned through their firewood in desperation. He'd seen what others couldn't see. He'd done what others wouldn't do. And he'd survived what killed so many others. That's the legacy, not the cabin, which is long gone, but the knowledge, the understanding, the principle. Snow is insulation. Cold can be fought with cold's own materials. Physics doesn't care about convention. It just is, and if you understand it, if you work with it instead of against it, you can survive anything. Even -72 degrees in Montana, even the coldest cold in American history. Lars Bergmann proved it, and his story reminds us that the knowledge that saves lives is often the knowledge that seems strangest at first. The wisdom that questions convention, the techniques that look like madness, until they work. And then they're just genius.